future is going to be mixed. Our physical spaces are going to be kind of contingent or really intermixed with our virtual spaces. And I think museums and cultural institutions at large maybe haven't been taking full advantage of that.
Hi, and welcome to the Culture and Technology Podcast. I'm your host, Severin Matusek. The Culture and Technology Podcast is a virtual salon initiated by the Vienna Business Agency, in which experts from Vienna and around the globe explore how technology is reshaping the future of culture. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the architecture of physical and virtual spaces. Architecture is a huge part of how we experience culture. Take the Museum of Fine Arts in Vienna, for example. When you enter it, you're welcomed by incredibly high ceilings, marble floors, and gold leaves, ready to take in some of history's most incredible fine art. It's clear that when the museum was built in the 19th century, it incorporated the values of its time in how art should be presented and worshipped. Now, digital spaces work in a very similar way, if you think about it. They too are built on certain values. Games, video calls, or even websites are designed according to certain principles that define how we interact in there. So, as the spaces in which we experience culture continually evolve and become more virtual, I wanted to invite two architects to help us understand how space shapes culture. Our first guest is Bika Rebek, a partner at architecture design firm Someplace Studio, who has created physical and virtual spaces with institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. She is joined by her old friend, Agustin Schang, who is an architect, a curator, and a culture producer. His work focuses on the intersection of architecture, culture, and the city, which he most recently brought to life as the associate producer of the Mile Long Opera, a public engagement project at the High Line in Manhattan. Together with Bika and Agustin, I sat down to explore the question, how are architecture and new technologies shaping the future of cultural experiences?
During this year and the pandemic, it became very clear what the role is. And I think the role is actually to create, that's a very personal definition, but I think it's to create social contact and to allow for a level of propinquity or people kind of accidentally encountering each other, running into each other, having somewhat unexpected, unplanned experiences. Because I think what we're really good at right now is doing things like this podcast. We're meeting at a specific time and having a specific conversation with a specific intent. But I think what spaces can do is sort of allow for people, to have this unexpected experience. And I think that's really missing right now. And I think that's something that I think we'll maybe be more aware of in the kind of years to come after that experience.
I'm curious, Agus, you don't work as an architect per se, I think. You come from a school of architecture, but you work as a culture producer and curator. But I think you really apply a lot of principles of architecture to producing cultural experiences. Is that correct? So how would you describe it?
We met actually doing a specific program here in New York, and we started understanding that architecture is definitely beyond the built environment. I mean, it's beyond the built form, and it's Bika being like someone more like an educator, me being like more like a cultural provocateur and infiltrator, as I try to call myself. I think we have also responsibility to for the general public to show architecture as this I was saying before, as something that is beyond the bare like aesthetic like built form, and also show them how any little architectural definition, or even how any kind of architectural situation that is being done by architects or urban planners can affect their lives. That both of us trying to do is to make sure that the architectural message could be more expanded and more democratic and reach more newer audiences.
Can you give an example of that? So how in your projects have you applied these principles of using architecture to reach more audiences, make more democratic access for the many people?
For me, the turning point really came when I started working at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. And I was there as an exhibition designer. And before that, I had worked in different firms and had worked mostly on, what you can call high-end, either residential things or wealthy investors, things like that, that often in locations far away that I would never even be able to visit. And so there was a certain dissociation from the work that I had done. I loved the design part, but it didn't feel like I could actually connect to the people that were going to use that architecture. And so when I started to do exhibition design at the Met, it's the most public thing, right? Like thousands, millions of people go sometimes to see these shows. And I could, on one hand, sort of be on site, experience these, not just the people visiting, but also the people making and building and setting up the exhibitions, all the different parts that came together, because the exhibitions are done relatively fast and well, they're not necessarily cheaper, but they always designed also with the premise of being accessible to everybody. We had to think about wheelchair access. We had to think about visually impaired people. We had to, really think about the large range of population that will come in. And then we also started to think about, and I think that influenced my work later, is also about digital access and really the whole user journey, from how somebody finds out about this to how they get there, what do they do there, how they take a break, all these things. And I think that really became defining for Someplace Studio and the office that we started later.
I'm so interested about your experience at the Met, because anyone who has been there in New York City knows it's this amazing place. It's so big. It has so many things to see. You feel like you've never reached an end with all the stuff that's there. So how would you say has this amazing public space influenced other projects that came after it? Like, can you give an example of maybe a recent exhibition or a recent architecture project that you worked on where you feel like, that's where some of the experience that I had at the Met really influenced my work and my thinking behind that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it reverberates in all the work we do in a way, because it was such an important experience. I always like to say it's my favorite job, except for having my own office. But very specifically, Uncanny Values at the Mark in Vienna, I think, was sort of, informed by that experience, because it was also a public institution, a kind of big exhibition with Malis Wirth, who's I think also on this podcast. So it had kind of similar parameters, but sort of applied to a more local context. But I think what I learned at the Met in terms of design also, and that was due to some of the people that I worked with, people like Susan Sellers, who's the head of 2x4, is to push institutions a little bit. So, big institutions like the Met and actually the MAC in Vienna as well, the Museum of Applied Arts, they have a long history, but they also sometimes can be a little slow, or, they're maybe not the most adventurous on their own. And so I kind of learned a little bit about not tactics, but just, that it's actually possible to push them, and then that they're really satisfied with that in the end. And I think that has been kind of a direct effect and learning experience that I could apply later.
Maybe that's a good transition to Agos, because I'm also interested in your experience with the cultural productions. Have you applied that in your work as well?
I think that's the main architectural characteristic. First, trying to plan and organize things for what we have. Coming from the global south, from South America, the conditions are never there. So when you're at school and you've been trained as an architect, it's apparently there is this idea that all the conditions are the thing that you need to fulfill, but in the real life, nothing of that applies. And I think that requires some kind of architectural way of thinking to work what would you have in terms of like from basic things, from budget to materials to site, and also to people that you're working with. All the ideas or you can see all the theories and theses actually ended up coming from production, ending coming from those kind of like forced and unexpected encounters with things, people, and places that, push us to come with some kind of a result. I think that interesting about architecture is also thinking about there have to be some kind of outcome. Again, going back to what we said before, it doesn't have to be extremely like a built outcome, but at least it have some kind of impact or affect it.
I'm actually interested in one particular example of your work that I researched, which is this project called the Mile Long Opera, which I think you were a big part of at the Highline. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. First, I want to give credit to Juliette Scofidius. She not only been the designer of the Highline, but also been working on this project for, I think, more than 6 years, trying to reconnect the park with the community.
No, so I just want to clarify to the audience what the Highline is, because maybe not everyone knows it, right? The Highline is this amazing park in the Chelsea district of Manhattan.
It is an elevated park that goes for like a month and a half, and there used to be a next piece of train infrastructure that was going to be demolished, and then a group of neighbors, I think more than 10, maybe 15 years ago, gathered together and started putting petitions to the city hall not to demolish, and also to somehow acknowledge the natural kind of like fauna and flora that appear there, and somehow keep that. And then through a competition, I think Dilas Cofidio won the commission, and they create this incredible park. The park create a great things for the area, revitalize kind of like a lost part of Manhattan. So this project was an interesting cultural experience designed by Liz Diller in connection with their performance background in the late 80s and 90s to reconnect the park with the community again. So I was the producer, as an associate producer of the project, in the beginning with 3 people working, and imagine them trying to gather 1,000 singers was more like trying to build Olympics. So my role there was me finding those participants, those singers that are going to be part of the project, and from the very beginning, for me, knowing the city and understanding how this process operates when gentrification and everything, making sure that we can bring the most diverse group of singers to the park.
I want to ask both of you as an open-ended question now. So when we talk about technology and when we talk about virtualization, the fact that we are here in a virtual podcast room talking to each other, how do you think about virtual spaces regarding the future of cultural experiences, but also the future of architecture? How do you use these virtual spaces and possibilities that we nowadays have to bring people together through architecture, essentially?
In my case, I think the not obsession, but I would say the interest in technology, actually, the origin is at the Angewandte in Vienna, because at university, studying with Greg Lynn and with the people who were around there was an incredible openness within the architecture curriculum towards trying new technologies. When you're in architecture school, you don't quite realize how you get pushed into certain directions. And I just thought that's the default. I thought everybody learns all these new technologies and knows how to use them and is kind of open to learning more of them. And then I went into other contexts and realized that that's not necessarily the case. And I think one thing I became particularly interested in is that same idea of how do we actually bring people together in virtual space, the way that that is really missing, and I think that especially in this pandemic we're noticing that is really missing. And this year in particular, I've gotten very much into VR out of the circumstances, and in particular started to work with Mozilla Hubs, which is an open source platform developed by Mozilla, and they essentially enable social VR rooms, so you can go in and hang out in a virtual space, and you can use it in VR on your headset, but it also very importantly works on a desktop and even on a phone. And here, this is where the accessibility comes in. It's not the coolest looking, the fastest, the bestest, the most technologically advanced platform, but it is the one that kind of combines a spatial technology with a very accessible technology that everybody can access. But I think there's a place and actually a need for architects to think about that, because we have a certain kind of training and theoretical background, practical background to think about these spaces, I think, in a slightly different way. Because a lot of what I see out there is, based on sort of the most typical space is a kind of replica of a real space. People rebuild things they know. They build a bar, they build that, and sometimes it's hard to find really innovative spaces. We're thinking about it and trying to figure out new ways of being together there.
I think we're living in a historical moment for this kind of virtual space, like for the virtual space in general, because we were all forced. The entire world was forced to go on a lockdown, and the whole world, was forced to communicate through some kind of digital platform. I'm talking about from social media to Zoom, and also start consuming, digital content. And most of this digital content, especially in culture, was trying to, as Bika was saying, replicating that kind of interior spaces in virtual spaces because people couldn't move. And it's interesting how that idea of representation of something was physical now slowly is changing about trying to be more like a design-oriented technique. The discussion, I feel, is now what that virtual space is going to look like. And in order to build on that, I think it's important there is an audience for this thing, that before it wasn't that clear there was an audience was interested in consuming that. And I think that's some kind of like positive kind of outcome of the pandemic. Like all the time, this kind of like more like the virtual as general was kind of a repository on this cultural institution and like afterthought of the physical, like the videos or the images, or even like if you have the money and the intentions and the aims to do this kind of virtual replicas. So I think that's so important, because that's somehow gonna like help us to kind of start imagining how the future is going to look like. I mean, if there is an audience that's been trained for 8 months to try to consume that, it means that they're going to be interested in pursuing that for many different reasons, like because that content could be 24/7 available. That means that we don't need to travel, that we also can be exposed to new environments.
I love that you have this view, but I think it's a little optimistic, at least in terms of what we're trying to do. My observation is that yes, people are clearly forced to be at home and try to use, existing technologies. But that's I think been the problem. Most people are happy to use Zoom and chat services and social media, but usually it doesn't go beyond that. I think the fear of technology is still there, and I think there's still a lot of work and outreach that we have to do in order for people to embrace this a little bit more engaging, but then sometimes also slightly more challenging experiences. Of course, young people, gamers, nerds, all these people are deep into it, and there's whole communities that exist online, that exist in VR, where people engage, form friendships that have never met in person, and all that kind of stuff. But most people our age, I would say, and older, are still quite reluctant. And I've had that experience now with building these spaces. I know people did it because mostly they would be my friends or interested, and they would come in and I would teach them. And everyone, my grandma went in there and she understood how to use it. So it's not that hard, but there is a hurdle, a psychological hurdle, I would say, for people to actually use these spaces. But I think before the pandemic, we already tried to do a lot of virtual projects, specifically with museums. And actually last year, 2019, maybe we had the wrong timing, but we went to a bunch of different cultural institutions, actually also in Vienna, and basically pitched, Tools for Show, which was kind of an iteration of a virtual platform that would allow museums to design in 3D on the web and then also present their projects. And they totally understood why it would be good, but nobody would be really interested in funding that. Because as you said, there's a premium on reality, there's a premium on sort of what we know, of course. And in a pandemic, I think that premium has gone, but the premium has kind of moved, I think, towards what the other thing that we know, which is the sort of very flat online experiences that that are easy to use and that people already know. So I think there's just a lot of work to be done there still.
But I feel that the future is going to be mixed. It's funny because I was reading these articles, like usually like this week about how a lot of museums in Europe would start like charging for the virtual tours, when before was something that was kind of like not even like thinking about it. And now, like, again, like I feel like every kind of, and I'm going to quote it, like access to kind of, I'm able to pay like a stream kind of service, they start understanding like the cost of that content and make sure they can pay for that and monetize that. I'm not saying that's the best example, but I'm still there is an audience that's going to go in that direction. What do you think about how is that going to be that kind of like human interaction within that virtual space? Besides that, you can choose your avatar and talk and chat with your people. Do you think that something's going to happen?
I think there'll be new rituals and new ways of engaging. I think with avatars, I think it's a little bit too young to really find out what happens. One thing I've noticed hanging out in VR is that each world has their own small talk. So, when you are in one particular environment, you're going to mostly be talking about that environment and what's happening there, and then you're going to be talking about maybe your gear, and so conversation get very directed by the environment you're in rather than maybe your personal connections or because usually you would meet people through a friend, or even if you meet them online, you have certain things in common, let's say, but what you have in common there is actually the space. And so that's quite interesting to me in terms of like the content of people talk about. But we are in this very skeuomorphic moment, right? Like we're when we started to have iPhones, the library looked like an actual sort of library with wood in the background, like a little bookshelf. And I think now we've learned that the library on your phone doesn't need to look that way, and we still understand that it's a library. And I think that transition hasn't quite happened yet in VR or in 3D social spaces. And I think that's going to be a really interesting process.
I love that example. I mean, to me as a non-architect, it sounds very exciting to say in traditional architecture, when you were building physical spaces that take a lot of time, cost a lot, you only see in the end how people are going to interact with it. So let's say you build a public square. Will people adapt it and use it and get creative within it or not? You will only see once it's there, right? Whereas in digital spaces, you can basically build a new space every day and test it with people to see how they interact. Is this something you actually do, Bika? That you test a lot to see how do people adopt and create these new rituals and behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, some practices that come from software design, and I'm very critical of sort of that hip adoption of, everything needs to come from the way that everything is called an incubator and has to be associated with that because it's hip right now. But there are some practices that are really useful, and that's something that I actually got exposed to and learned at New Inc. It was a cultural incubator in New York City at the New Museum, and the whole idea is that it's an incubator for artists or for people who are in the creative fields, but teaches them some of these methods that are usually used in software design. And I think that that's something that I actually now try to apply to physical spaces as well. So we are big fans of mock-ups, of getting people to be involved. And sometimes it's really as simple as in the early design process, putting yourself into kind of first person perspective, literally, but even just mentally, emotionally, kind of walking through a space. And that's something I ask my students always to do. I'm like, imagine yourself in the space. And that's not so, it seems so obvious, but it actually isn't traditionally necessarily part of architecture. Architecture has always been a very, very bird's eye view profession, right? The master plan, the idea that we have to kind of think large and think of the system and think of the organization. But the idea that you actually think of the user and the affordances of your architecture is still quite new and something I'm really excited about.
I feel like there's this eternal balance between the audience and the producer, or the audience and the architect, right? So what you said, Biko, I thought was quite interesting to say, well, technology is still flat. So people are still basically using very easy things that are convenient because it's so easy in the digital space to just switch off. And we see that with tons of content that's being produced. Like if a Netflix show doesn't capture you in the first 2 minutes, people just switch off, which means, a lot of things get just much more streamlined and less critical or less challenging. I just put that out there. I guess it's the same when you design an exhibition at the Met. It's like you basically you probably want to challenge people in their approach and their thinking, but you can't also challenge them too much because it might get overwhelming and overbearing. So what do you both of you think of this balance of how much can you push an audience to adopt new ways of thinking about things or new ways of adopting new technologies? And how much do you have to maybe scale back a little and still make sure it's not overwhelming and still a very broad mass of people can actually access it and use it?
I mean, when you're working with bigger institutions, I mean, probably the topic more broad, and the audiences are more general, and you have to, scale back, as you were saying. But when they had the minute to work, for example, a recent project I did also in the pandemic was working with American Society, that is a very interesting organization in New York with a long history of promoting Latin American artists from New York to the world, I guess. And it was the very first time we managed to bring contemporary architecture to them, So again, it was like the challenge for us was trying to see how deep we can go into the language and how specific, not only because the institution was more about art, it wasn't about architecture, but also understanding that we were bringing those Latin American practitioners to like a broader public that wasn't, didn't have the language. So in that way, we were showing them that architecture was beyond just like a little, building in some place in South America. And we can talk about, things from racial issues to affordable housing towards specific design constraints toward human planning.
I mean, even at the Met, people had to actually go there and put some kind of commitment into, and probably stand even in line and go through a crowd. So you can actually expose them to quite a bit, and they won't just leave right away because they already made some effort to go there. And when you're clicking onto a website, and like you said, if you don't like it immediately, you're just going to close it, and that's it, end of experience. So I do think we have to, again, be thinking of the user journey in virtual space as well, and kind of, pick people up where they are, and help them engage in these journeys in different ways. And for example, when we do hubs events, we always have a Zoom call going on at the same time, just because that's something that we know people are familiar with. And so we often start with that, we kind of explain the idea there, and then we switch over, and there's always kind of like a safe space you can go back to if you get lost, or if something happens in in the VR space, that there's people there in a format that you're familiar with. So I think creating these bridges and this sort of padding around experiences is really important. And there's a lot of innovation this year. There's definitely been a lot of different ways that people have thought about that, not always successfully, and that's what's interesting. Sort of how you can really look at this year. I should probably do an analysis, pandemic sort of accessibility in virtual space or something like that.
I think something you touch upon here is the word access in a way. You mentioned that in the beginning of the conversation, when at the Met you designed for wheelchair use and so on. And I think besides the pandemic, what 2020 has also brought upon are these movements like Black Lives Matter, is an increasing focus worldwide on the topic of inequality, diversity, exclusion, inclusion. So what do you think about when it comes to designing for access, understanding that maybe all of us are biased because we come from a certain background, because we come from a certain philosophy, and so on. So how do you try to include that in your practice to not fall into these biases and exclude people, or design for as many diverse people as possible?
One way that we start to think about is our office structure. We have actually always been remote first because our office is distributed between Vienna and New York, and we also travel a lot. And so our entire infrastructure is online anyway. But I think we always had this idea that maybe we'll have a physical office at some point. And we gave that up this year also with a thinking of hiring practices. So we just had our first fully remote intern. And what that allows us to do is actually hire people who are not necessarily like us, who don't live in cities, who might have a different background. And that in itself, I think, is important to bring different voices to the table.
And Agus, is this something, can you share something from your current thinking about how to do that? When it comes to a new project, how do you make sure to address so many diverse needs and personalities and backgrounds to actually access these productions that you do?
Two things. I think that being based in New York, even though it's still a very unequal place, it's forced myself, coming where I'm coming, to understand that there is a world, there is an urban space extremely diverse. First, second, it's like I always think, and especially think like now more than ever, like I think there is a responsibility as a producer, as a practitioner, to bring over, as Bika was explaining with her office, like make sure that somehow you bring the most diverse group of voices and narratives to whatever projects you are working on. And that's, again, going back to that small like virtual / infiltrator project that we did at American Society. For me, like try to find in those practitioners, Latin American practitioners that weren't like the basic rich white male was so important. The interesting thing will happen is after you put it out there. I mean, what are the connections you start seeing those people having with other similar groups, or happening with those practitioners that are invited to places that weren't invited before? How you make sure those names start circulating among other scholars or other practitioners or other curators? And I think that we have to acknowledge the power position that you have when you in that place, and making sure you do with responsibility, and making sure that whatever decision you're going to make you're going to have an impact.
Let's say you talk to an institution an institution that could be a museum, a theater, an association, a society that has a physical space, and they want to put up a new exhibition or they want to put up a new production. What would you suggest to a cultural institution of how to adapt to this new world of technology, virtual spaces, in order to reach an audience and do something exciting?
The future is going to be mixed. I think, this idea of hybrid design, or the idea that our physical spaces are going to be kind of contingent or really intermixed with our virtual spaces. I mean, it's already happening with our smartphones in our pockets and so on, but I think museums and cultural institutions at large maybe haven't been taking full advantage of that. And so I think that integration will increase. And that's also something I think that we're quite interested in as an office, is to explore these intersections and to explore, I talked a lot about VR, but AR is actually also really, really interesting in that regard, right? In terms of mixed reality, MR, augmented reality is AR. So I think, and those are even just current technologies. I think it will even increase. And again, it's not about using a fancy word. It's more about thinking about the itinerary of somebody and picking up people who are already online, bringing them to the physical space, and then picking up the people who are in the physical space and bringing them online, right? I think it's a little bit about that exchange. Yeah, I think that's what I would tell a museum.
I think most of the institutions realize that your audience is not just the number of people getting to your physical space that go through the doors. I think that idea of having someone counting there with a counter, I think it's just already totally outdated. I think now the institutions understand and understood, hopefully, that that's need to happen, because I think also talking about the future, that one-on-one relationship with exhibition, but also the possibility of expanding their mission and the programming worldwide. Period. I mean, that's going to happen. And then how that going to come back to them, as members, as people that are going to support the institution in many different capacities, not only money. I think that they start realizing that they're not geographical limits anymore.
Yeah, I have an example actually. This year, the Future Architecture Platform, which is I used to be a participant in it, and Agus actually was in it as well. And I've been on the advisory board for a few years. They're a very physical event. The whole idea is to connect a number of institutions across Europe, architecture museums and galleries, they have slightly different profiles, from very large ones to very small ones, but it's kind of a network between all these different institutions. And the idea is to support young architects by basically flying them all over Europe and bringing them to these institutions and doing various projects, lectures, and events there. So this year, it was a total dilemma as to what to do now. I mean, the whole premise is that it's about social connection, about people getting to know each other and doing things together. And so the platform then, under guidance of Anastasia Smirnova, built a platform called Rooms, and it was quite simple. It was basically just a website that allowed every institution to kind of showcase their work through a video or some other online format. But it was really helpful actually in bringing everybody together. And now we're talking about the next steps, and they want to keep it. Of course, it's already there. We can expand it, and it's a great. It's not that now we're going to go back to normal and forget about that. I think it's people are going to just have both, and kind of the physical and the virtual formats will feed into each other. I do think that geography is still important. Actually, I don't think we will, and I don't think we want to get rid of it. I think in terms of language, it's important to actually cultivate local languages, and also in terms of audience, I think it's important to speak to a very specific audience and not try to make everything entirely global. So I think that's going to be an interesting negotiation where museums and institutions can sort of fine tune or define which kind of how big or how specific they want their audience to be. With our own website, I can see that most people who can go into analytics and sort of see where people look at your website. And obviously anybody in the world could look at it. But most of the hits are in New York and in the US and in Germany, because we have a project there now. And when we had a project in Austria, there were more hits in Austria. So there's something extremely local about how people use the internet that we're not acknowledging. We always talk about, it's global, everybody can go. Yeah, but no, it's not. Right. Again, to my point earlier, you have to kind of you have to put a lot of work in to people actually accessing this spaces. Just putting it online is not going to make it accessible. What's going to make it accessible is putting in really hard work to promote it, to advertise it, to make podcasts, to do all these different things to bring people in.
And it's true that the virtual have a different type of competition. The offer is out there, and and if you have the privilege to have a device to access, that's another thing that we need to acknowledge.
Another topic you just touched upon is data. I think we have an episode on its own about data, but I think what's so interesting about what you both just said is that in the past, or let's say in a non-digital, non-technological world, a lot of the things you do is guesswork in the end, or it's based on experience and curation and councils of experts coming together thinking, we think this is the right approach, or this is the right approach. Essentially what we have now because of digital experiences is so much data about the audience. Like, let's say if I was an institution, I'm going to put up an exhibition next year and I'm going to put a lot of money in it. It's probably a good idea to test it in a virtual environment first to see how does the audience respond. And then I take these insights from 100 people who have been to my virtual exhibitions and saying they like this and they like that. And then I put it in the real world for 10,000 people to see it possibly. Is this something you also think about, these data points that you get in order to design and be closer to, you said, Bika, the user, the so-called user?
We are super interested in that. In general, I think the data is quite an issue in terms of like, how do we organize it? How do we deal with all that data? My friends at Channel Studio, they're graphic designers, but build websites that work with AI and data collection. And they're doing, I think, really, really interesting work in that realm. And they said something beautiful once where they were saying, how can we sort of bring all the data that we've produced together into one world? Because right now it exists in so many different formats. And I think that thinking applies to exhibitions, because exhibitions in the end are also just a bunch of data. But traditionally that data has been, kind of treated in a certain way, put on a show with lots of love and effort, usually by everyone involved, and then it disappears. And that's fine. That there's something poetic in that as well. But I think in terms of how do we archive that kind of data? How do we bring it together into one ecosystem? I mean, that's actually probably the challenge of our generation, really. I don't think any individual is going to solve that, but it's something that I think we should be also thinking about as designers, and think about kind of the whole life cycle of these exhibitions. And again, something where the digital and the virtual can influence each other, because the digital can become a repository or an archive of the physical.
And I'm going to leave this here because I think it could open to a new podcast. But I mean, like the idea of like the permanence and then impermanence, and I think that what are the things that we need to archive? What's going to be the one-on-one physical experience in the future? I mean, I'm talking the future, not in the next 6 months. I'm talking like in the next 10 years.
I think the question of permanence and impermanence is a very important one, right? Because you could also argue, that a lot of the virtual stuff is also so fleeting, right? I mean, you can build these amazing spaces in a virtual world and people engage with it for 2 hours and then it's gone. Whereas physical spaces have this permanent structures to it that make it, the experience of it, the cultural experience of it, make it different per se. I don't know, Bika, do you have some thoughts on like, is there a permanence to virtual experiences?
I think the physical is not as permanent as it's made out to be. Buildings are constantly changing, and I'm not talking about the human horizon, but historically, buildings tend to disappear. In some cultures, like in Japan, they're actually also designed to not last for a very long time. We talked about exhibitions earlier. I mean, all the work that I did at the Met, for example, is long gone, and the only archive of that at this point is virtual. So I think we just haven't figured out how to really preserve virtual memories and how to create a virtual archaeology. That's the challenge I was talking about earlier. And that's, I think, what's really important, because I think it would be a pity if all these formats and early experimentations are lost because we don't figure out how to preserve that data. And inevitably, a lot of it is going to be lost, and that's okay. But, I think developing these tools and data sets to collect that data is just of utmost importance. But yeah, I think there's also people who print out all their digital photos as a backup in the physical and put them in certain conditions to make sure that they're preserved. So I think the answer isn't on one side, actually. I think it's kind of a two-sided coin again.
And that's it. As usual, you can check out the show notes in your podcast app to discover more references and links to the concepts, projects, and great minds that accompanied us throughout our virtual salons. I personally have learned a lot over the last 6 conversations, and I hope you have too. We'll be back with more episodes soon, so please subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay in the loop. Finally, the Culture and Technology podcast is produced by the Vienna Business Agency. The Vienna Business Agency supports Vienna's businesses, economy, and creative industries, and in doing so, shapes the city's future. Bye for now.